Good evening. Is this on? Yes. Good evening. It is a pleasure to see all of you here, and thank you very much for joining us this evening for the Dal Travis Lecture Series featuring Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer. As we begin this evening's event, I'd like to acknowledge where we stand. We have the privilege of gathering today in the ancestral lands of the Onondaga Nation, the center of the Six Nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, who we honor for their many contributions, including the original philosophy and practice of environmental stewardship. The Dal Travis Lecture Series was established in 2012 with the goal of informing the public about the incredible research that's done here at ESF. And we are pleased to be joined tonight by the lecture's founders and sponsors, Dal Travis and Sigrid Freundorfer. Dal and Sigrid, would you be willing to stand so we could recognize you? Thank you very much for creating this opportunity for us to highlight the outstanding faculty research. We're deeply grateful for you doing this. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer, an ESF alumni. Dr. Kimmerer is a plant ecologist, writer, and SUNY Distinguished Teaching Professor here at ESF. Robin serves as the founding director of the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment, whose mission is to create programs which draw on the wisdom of both Indigenous and scientific knowledge for our shared goals of sustainability. Robin's research interests include the role of traditional ecological knowledge in ecological restoration and the ecology of mosses. She's also the author of Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants, a New York Times bestseller. Robin, thank you for joining us this evening. I know that all of us are looking forward to your lecture. And then after the lecture, you, our audience, are all invited to join us in the concourse for a dessert reception. And that is thanks to Dal and Sigrid for providing that for us. And without further delay, I hope you all enjoy tonight's presentation, Returning the Gift, the Role of a Nature Writer on the Edge of Climate Catastrophe. I welcome Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer.
Thank you for that nice introduction, and thank you, Dale and Sigrid, for this wonderful opportunity to bring us all together. I want to begin with a traditional protocol greeting and say, Bonjour, Ani, Shabadas Kegish Kokwena Deshnakas, Bodwe Wad Mekwenda, Megazedo dem, Minwa Makodo dem, Mikwech Kinegego, Gamijang. And in our beautiful Potawatomi language, I give you greetings and tell you that I'm a member of the Bear Clan and also of the Eagles of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation. It's also part of our traditional protocol to also begin with gratitude for all that surrounds us, because we are showered every day with gifts from the earth. What some people call natural resources are gifts from the earth. And if you cast your mind back to this morning and remember that you had everything that you needed. Gratitude for each other, for those of you coming in on this beautiful, mild fall evening to spend time together thinking. And of course, a special recognition for our guests from Onondaga Nation. It fills my heart to have you here and to recognize that SUNY ESF does stand in the territories of the Onondaga Nation. And when I think about the unpaid debt of history, of land and knowledge and being good neighbors, I'm very, very grateful. And we can think that when we begin with gratitude, that we can be inspired to live in such a way that one day the earth will be grateful for us, for our presence as well. I also want to just invoke this idea of the gifts and responsibilities that all of us carry. In our teachings, we are told that every being, human beings, bats, salamanders, goldenrod, every one of us were given a gift to live here on the earth, but that gift comes with a responsibility. Just like those wood thrushes were given that beautiful gift of the lovely song, they're also given the responsibility to sing down the sun in the evening. And so I want us to think together as we encounter some of these ideas, what are our gifts and what are our responsibilities? I also want to think about, as we acknowledge where we stand, how is it that we as a university community, as a community living here in Haudenosaunee homelands, how do we go beyond land acknowledgement to thinking about land justice? And what is our work in creating justice and decolonizing education, decolonizing conservation? Because on the same day that ESF first put forward its land acknowledgement, we also had a day-long workshop to say, well, what does that mean? How do we do that? How do we enact our responsibilities for the gift of living in this place? And so today's talk is really informed by our thinking of how do we go beyond acknowledgement. And I was asked this evening to talk about something really, seems sort of silly, to talk about braiding sweetgrass, to talk about my own journey as a writer, the work of braiding sweetgrass. And so instead of giving a research talk, I want to talk about some of the themes in braiding sweetgrass, about some of the influences and the work that this writing has inspired. And later on this month, over at SU, I'll be giving a talk more of a literary nature on the book if anybody wants to follow up even farther. And what I would like to share with you is that when I first began braiding sweetgrass, conceiving of braiding sweetgrass many years ago, I knew what it was that I wanted to write, but honestly, I didn't know that anyone would want to read it. And despite a lifetime as a reader, I had never seen stories like my own on the page, stories of a native scientist, somebody who is in love with land and with language, with spirit and with science. And I didn't have an agent or much experience, but I just sent it off on the wind. And when people asked me what sort of book it was, I honestly didn't even know the genre that it belonged to. That was an awkward moment, like, well, I don't know. Was this a plant book? Was it an indigenous book, an environmental book, a spiritual book, a feminist science book, somebody asked me? And I really couldn't say, was it a memoir or a manifesto? You can be the judge. But when folks asked me, well, what section of the bookstore does it belong in? Well, that seemed a little easier. And the answer was usually nature writing. And so I want to talk about what does it mean to be a nature writer on the edge of climate catastrophe. Because as you know, I'm trained as a scientist, not as a writer. And so I am asking myself this question of what does it mean to be a writer in these really urgent times? And because I am going to get to talk about that, but knowing that this is an audience primarily of ESF students, and knowing that ESF students are the best students anywhere, really. Idealistic, save the world students who are going to make all kinds of difference in the world. But I know that you, like probably all of us in the room, are at a place when we are confronting the reality of climate chaos, living in the age of the sixth extinction, and confronting overdue reckoning with the consequences of colonization. It's a time when it could feel very reasonable to feel powerless, to feel somewhat discouraged. And so I thought that to start off with, I owe you a story of change and the ways in which change can happen, because you will be the change makers. And it was 51 years ago, this very September, with the goldenrod and asters in bloom, that this story begins. I was really lucky to grow up on the land. Outside all the time, the plants were my companions, and I was the kid who would stop my bike just because I saw another plant that I never met before. I would have stacks of pressed plants under my bed and little spore prints on my bookshelf. My mother was very patient with me, as perhaps your mothers were with you as well. So I really figured that I would be a botanist. But when it came time to go to college, I was kind of torn whether I could be a botanist or whether I would be a poet for my love of language. And you know what? I was told in those times, you can't do both of those things. Those are really different. So you're going to have to choose. And in the interest of getting to play outside more and the matter of earning a living, I thought I probably ought to choose botany. And here's the story that I want to share with you in this September when the goldenrod and asters were in bloom. Some of you may have read Braiding Sweetgrass, and if so, this story might be familiar to you. But I think it's so instructive for students that I want to share it again. 51 years ago, there were not many women at the College of Forestry, as it was called then. And I knew that I would not only be one of few women, but I would certainly be the only Native person on campus. And so I wanted to make a good impression. I wanted to be ready for my first day when I knew I had an interview and all of that. And so when my botany professor said to me, "So Miss Wall, why do you want to study botany?" I had my answer already. And it was wrapped up in these plants, in these goldenrod and asters, who, as you know, share a habitat, a roadside habitat, a meadow habitat. But instead of growing purple over here and orange over here, yellow over here, they grow together in this stunning visual display. And I thought that was a pretty good ecological question. So I said, I want to know why goldenrod and asters look so beautiful together. Thank you for laughing, Steph. That's just what he did. He said, "My dear, that is not science." He said, "If you want to study beauty, you should have gone to art school." Oh, big mistake. Maybe I was in the wrong place. And so I said, "Well, I also want to know why plants make medicines for us." Also not science, he said. So you can see how this went. But he promised to put me right and said, "You come take general botany, and then you'll learn about what plants are really like." And I had no rejoinder. I had no vocabulary of resistance to be able to speak up. I only had embarrassment that I had made a mistake, that I had misunderstood what science was, that I had somehow misunderstood what botany was. And so he signed me up for classes, and I was dismissed to go get my freshman photo taken. You can see why I looked so happy that day. The old dean of students had this photo tucked in his desk drawer, and it came back to me. I was told that I looked like Patty Hearst without the machine gun. And you know, I didn't think about it at the time, but I sure do now, that my first day of education was not unlike my grandfather's first day of education. My grandfather, who as a little boy of 9 years old, was taken from his family in Oklahoma and sent to the Carlisle Indian School, whose notorious mission was to kill the Indian and save the man, where he too was told that his way of knowing, his way of understanding the world was not welcome there, and that they would teach him what was important. They would teach him the way the world should be. And so with that in mind, let's just pause for a moment and think about this as a gift and a responsibility that comes with this story, which is present in so many of our families. What is the gift? What is the responsibility? Tonight, we're going to talk about science, but we're also going to talk about justice. And taking children under the guise of education is not justice. The erasure of knowledge and culture is not justice. And think about the land. What do you suppose were the impacts on the land herself of the attempted erasure of our knowledge for land care? What are the connections between ecological sciences and justice? We'll talk about that. So anyway, this story that many of you know of my experience here at ESF was that I was looking for something that didn't exist here 51 years ago. I said this is a story of change. And students, I'm telling you this story because I want you to know about the possibility of change, that culture can change and that you can change it. And as you know, I came back to ESF many years later. It was 30 years ago that I joined the faculty here. And I was again one of the only women on campus and the only Native person on campus. I said things change. I didn't say they change fast, but they change. And you know, I was told at that time, when I was a real beginner here, that what I ought to do was kind of keep quiet about the Native American thing, and then I would be able to be, you know, fit in here, do my science. Well, you know, have you ever had the experience of somebody telling you not to do something? And the powerful motivation that provides, pay attention to those moments when your resistance comes up and says, no. Somebody telling you what not to do can be the energy you need to do it, but you know what's so much better? Is somebody inviting you to give your gifts and your responsibility, to say you belong here, and this is what we need here. And that is what happened to me at ESF. And I'm really grateful for the opportunities to do this work at the intersection of Indigenous knowledge and Western science. And as evidence of that, right down the hall, on the same floor, from where I was told, you should have gone to art school, we have the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment. Yeah. And as Joni said, our whole mission is to bring together these ways of knowing, not to erase, to assimilate, to lose this knowledge, but to celebrate this knowledge and bring it into our shared missions of caring for each other and caring for the land. And we have such an amazing community here. I just, every day, I think, I am so grateful I get to work with Neil Patterson every day, with Tusha, with Catherine, with Stuart, with this amazing community. And we get to practice two-eyed seeing. We get to use this metaphor of saying, you know, when we look at the world, there's more than one lens to look at the land with. And for the longest time, our universities have been an intellectual monoculture, dominated only by Western scientific ways of thinking about the land and relationships. And so at the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment, we try to embrace this model of two-eyed seeing. This wonderful graphic was made by one of our students to really model this, to say, well, how much more could we learn if we looked at the world, yes, with the tools of Western science, but guided by the wisdom, the philosophy, and the long practice of Indigenous science as well. And that's how we try to do our work with our wonderful students who you see here, a small group of them at this spring's graduation celebration. So in that spirit, students, of reverse psychology, students and faculty, let me say, you should never, never attempt to bring your whole self to science. Don't bring diverse cultural perspectives into the academy. Don't do it. Yeah? Yeah? Okay. Because back to gifts and responsibilities. You know, I remember sitting around a fire at a tribal gathering, and the truth is that some of the folks were really teasing me about plant knowledge and saying, you know, oh, well, now that you've been to the university, you really know about plants. You're really educated, aren't you? These are people who spent their lives in the woods knowing everything there is to know about the plants. So they were giving me a hard time, justifiably, but we got to talking about what does it mean to be an educated person. And we had a lot of laughs and a lot of good discussions, and then it all came down to that this is not education that erases gifts and puts the same homogenized responsibilities on everyone. An educated person is someone who knows their own gift and how to give them in the world. And that, too, is the way that we run the center, to try to say, what is your gift? What is it that you are bringing from your cultural perspective to help us understand how it is that we might live better in peace on this planet? So, back to what I was going to talk about, being a nature writer in this particularly urgent moment. And I think it's important to say that while you know me as Robin Wall Kimmerer, it's not my real name. My real name is Shabadaske Gish Kokwe, the light shining through, the sky woman. And in our ways, our names, which are given to us, are meant to make us think and seek our path our whole lives long. What does this mean? What does this mean to carry this name? No one tells you. You need to figure it out your whole life. And so while they're not prescriptions or directions, I look and I say, well, what do those beams of light do? What could they teach me? How could they guide me in this question of what is the work of a nature writer? What is it that I am here to do, that we are here to do collectively? So you think about it, what do those rays do as they come down from the clouds? They certainly create beauty, and they illuminate a place on the earth, don't they? If you're lucky, you can walk right into one, and you see what you've never seen before. So I take some guidance in that, in answering this question of what does it mean to be a nature writer, to shine a light on the living world, to illuminate them better so that we could see. And I really think that that is an invitation to use that most wonderful word in the English language. I still love to hear it, and I love to hear my grandchildren say it. They say, look, look. Isn't that wonderful? Don't you cherish that moment of seeing, of looking? And that, I think, is the job of the nature writer, to say, look. And the work of a nature writer in a time of climate crisis is to say, look at the more than human world that sustains us. Look what we are doing. And so the role of the nature writer, I wonder, is to illuminate, to try to illuminate, and to pay attention, to harness our power of attention. And I can sympathize with that most recognized of American settler nature writers, Thoreau, who wrote, "I have the habit of attention to such excess that my senses get no rest, but suffer from constant strain." I don't really find that a strain. It's more of a joy to just look and look and look. But you know, paying attention in a world that gives us maple syrup and sandhill cranes and spotted salamanders, shouldn't we at least be paying attention? And paying attention, I think, is a gift and a responsibility. It's a gift that keeps on giving, because attention generates more wonder, which generates more joy. Paying attention to the more than human world, though, doesn't lead only to amazement. It's a gift and a responsibility, because when we are open and attentive, we see and feel equally the beauty and the wounds. We see the old growth, but we also see the clear cut, the mountain and the mine. Paying attention to the suffering of the earth sharpens our ability to respond, i.e., to be responsible. And that becomes a gift, because when we fall in love with the living world, we can't be bystanders to its destruction. I know you know that. That's why you are here. Attention becomes intention, and intention coalesces itself into action. And you, as ESF students, have the incredibly well-developed abilities to pay attention to the natural world, but most people don't, especially to the plants. And in fact, conservation biologists have coined this term plant blindness to capture this idea that people don't see plants. They don't really understand their significance in the world. And that has consequences for conservation policy, because most of the conservation funding goes to so-called charismatic megafauna, right? The grizzly bears and the panda bears of the world. Now, as Joni said, I'm a moss ecologist, so I want to stand up not just for charismatic megafauna, but for charismatic microflora, to pay attention to the living world. And when we think about plant blindness, our ancestors did not suffer from plant blindness the way that we do today. We know that our grandparents and our great-grandparents knew hundreds of plants and their personalities and their uses and where they grow. Did you know that today, the average American school kid can recognize 100 different corporate logos? The skills that you as ESF students are using to learn dendrology and entomology and mycology, they're the same skills of identifying things like logos. Our intellectual ability to pay attention to the living world has been hijacked. It has been hijacked because those same students who can recognize 100 corporate logos recognize 10 plants. And when you look at the list of the plants that they recognize, it includes grass and Christmas tree. We're losing species left and right. We have lost an entire vocabulary of speech, of name, of relationship. Our fundamental currency of relationship, our ability to pay attention, has been subverted in a kind of intellectual hijacking, as I said. And is it any wonder then? This has consequences. Is it any wonder that we accept a political system that grants legal personhood to corporations and none at all to birch trees or to blue jays? That is an outcome of this kind of plant blindness and failure to recognize the gifts of the beings who are around us. We need to change that. The role of the nature writer might be to inform. Taking a historical perspective, there was a time when nature writers were primarily educators about natural history. And when I was When I was a kid, my favorite shelf in the library was the natural history section. No surprise. And John Burroughs in particular, I loved his writing because it was writing that was designed to engage the public with paying attention to the living world. And he was such a revolutionary figure that, do you know that natural history became a mandatory part of public education in this country because of the work of a nature writer. But is that, John Burroughs, and I act like I'm surprised. Yes, I invited him. He wrote so many books about natural history, but he was also very well known for what was called the art of seeing, of helping people see the world. With his book Sharp Eyes, his book The Art of Seeing Things. And seeing things and informing people about what it is that they see is incredibly important, especially in his time. But we live today in the age of information, when all of this information is at our fingertips. It's on our cell phones. I think we are beyond needing more information. It is wisdom that we need. And scientific ecological knowledge is not the realm in which wisdom lives, by design. But traditional ecological knowledge incorporates wisdom, not just answering true-false questions of hypothesis testing, but at that nexus where values intersect with the living world, can answer questions about right and wrong. Is the job of a nature writer just to inform? Well, a few years ago, the AAAS came out with a study that probably many of you were shocked at. Well, maybe not shocked at, but sad to see that it was actually documented. Information makes no difference in decision making. What the AAAS demonstrated was that scientific information does not change people's minds. It's not p-values that mattered. It's cultural values. And so, what is the job of a nature writer? To go beyond information into what Jonathan Swift characterized as vision. Beyond the art of seeing that was polished by John Burroughs to the art of vision, where vision is the art of seeing what is invisible to others. But what is invisible to others depends on what lenses you're using in the world, right? So what do we see when we use multiple lenses, multiple ways of knowing? And what might we learn by looking through the lens of indigenous science? I think that the job of a nature writer is to illuminate multiple ways of knowing, to see the world differently, and expand our thinking from an intellectual monoculture of looking at the world only through the lens of Western science, and to include indigenous knowledge. I want to give you just a really small example of that, appropriate again to our student audience. You know that conservation biologists, environmental biologists, forest managers, we look at old growth forests, right? And we think about not only how few are left, we think about the processes that led to their virtual erasure. But we also think about what we could learn from old growth forests, about how forests are supposed to be put together, about the relationships that bind them together, about the structure and the function of the world without extraction. As ecologists, we honor studying old growth forests. We should also be honoring studying old growth cultures, embracing old growth cultures for the principles which organize living systems. To live in right relationship with the land is a property of old growth cultures. If we used two-eyed seeing, we would use not only the intellect, which is privileged in Western science, but we would use the embodied knowledge, spiritual knowledge, and emotional knowledge all together in order to fully understand how it is that we might live in a just way here on Earth. what would we see if we looked through that Indigenous lens at land? This was something that was a great puzzle to me when I came as a student all those years ago. I came from a worldview in which the natural world, the trees and the plants were our family, and they were our relatives. They were subject, but in the strictly Western ways of thinking, they're not subjects, they're objects. This is a diagram of an ecosystem that's familiar to many of you, I know, from your ecology classes. Is this an ecosystem? This was really troubling to me. Like, wait, I have stepped into a different worldview here. In coming to a college of forestry at that time, the very meanings of land that we get by just looking through the Western lens is that what is land? Through the Western lens, land is property. That is its primary meaning. And what is property? It's rights. It's legal rights to exclude others from that parcel of terrain, right? It's the right to dominate and control because you own it. Because land is capital. Because land is almost synonymous with natural resources. And think about what natural resources means. It means this is a source of raw material that we can convert for our own uses. And of course, land as ecosystem services. Those are the ways in which, through that Western lens, we look at land. But through the lens of Indigenous ways of knowing, the land is our identity. You're almost inseparable from the land herself. Land certainly as our sustainer, land as a residence, not only for our own species, but for all of our relatives. Land as the connection to our ancestors. Land as the library, land as the pharmacy, land as inspirited, land as home, and land not as the place for which we claim rights, but as the place where we enact our moral responsibility to that which gives us life. A really different view of the world through that other set of glasses in which the land is sacred. You might be saying to yourself, two-eyed seeing, that sounds like a good idea. I want to expand my way of thinking about the land. Well, why does this matter? There's so many ways to think about that, and that's what we do at the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment. Why does this matter? But I want to give you just one example, again, appropriate to our ESF student audience in particular. Did anybody read this report from the UN Biodiversity panel a few years ago? It's heartbreaking. It documents the exponential decline in biodiversity all over the planet. But there's a bright spot in this report. And it says there are places on this planet where biodiversity loss is not high. And those are in indigenous homelands all over the world. If you look at a map of biodiversity hotspots that's familiar to you conservation biologists out there, but what is less familiar in our STEM disciplines is to overlay onto a map of species biodiversity a map of language diversity, indigenous language diversity, and they map almost 1 for 1. Those places under indigenous stewardship have thriving biodiversity. Shouldn't we know why? Use two-eyed seeing to understand why and how indigenous land management not only generates but maintains biodiversity. The ways in which Native people monitor and respond and manage using indigenous science to care for not their natural resources that they're going to exploit, but their relatives. The cultural values inherent in indigenous ways of knowing have impact for how we all live on the planet and whether other species will live as well. Did you know that 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity is safeguarded by indigenous peoples? In a College of Environmental Science and Forestry, that should make you sit up in your chair, right? But when we think about the fact that indigenous peoples, this is hard to measure globally speaking, but the estimate, and I think it's 50% because nobody really knows, is that indigenous peoples manage about 50% of the land mass here through traditional practices, but they have legal title to only 10% of that land. And so it's under constant threat. And the biodiversity and the cultural diversity inherent in those places are also under threat. And so where in the world was I? I just got talking and was, oh yes, all right, there we go. Pardon me a second, that's the problem with having a structure when really you just want to tell stories. All right. This notion that that this light pattern, the light shining through the sky, is a sign also of weather change, isn't it? You know, that's something else that I learn when I say, well, what does this mean? How does this help answer the question of what it is we are to do? And it is perhaps to promote change, that the role of the nature writer is to change the story. Change the story away from this human exceptionalism, this fictional pyramid of human well-being in the way that the world is organized, with certain members of only one species in charge of everything else and all other beings below them. Can we change that story from anthropocentric worldview to a kin-centric worldview of thinking about the world as our relatives, not as our property? And I'm excited, as you probably are, to know as well that change happens. Change happens with two-eyed seeing that we are now in a place where all over the world scientists are recognizing the value of indigenous science and knowledge. So much so that you probably are aware, I don't think I could have ever imagined I'd hear these words in my career, that the President of the United States declared and has an executive action that in all federal land management decisions, traditional ecological knowledge must now be part of land management decision-making. Change can happen. Change can happen when we look at the world through multiple lenses. I now want to turn our attention to the fact that when you do look at the world through the indigenous lens as well as the colonizer lens, the Western lens, you see things differently. You see the impacts of the Western lens only on our land and on our people. And oftentimes, as members of the environmental science research community, we often think about our jobs as talking about the land, but it's also our job to talk about the relationship between land and people, and to recognize that those systems of injustice that oppress people with violence and erasure also oppress lands and biodiversity with violence and erasure. And rarely in my time as a scientist have I heard attempted erasure of traditional peoples understood as an ecological influence. Let me give you just one example. Within the forest management and conservation community today, there is a lot of interest in the role of fire in land management. And when I was coming up as a scientist, and it's true even today, people talk about the environmental impact of fire suppression, right? The way that it inhibits biodiversity, et cetera. What I would like to know is, why do we say that? We say that, oh, the land is suffering from fire suppression. The land is suffering from colonization. The land is suffering from the displacement of indigenous peoples from their homelands and using fire. My people, Potawatomi, are people of the fire. Our people were jailed for lighting off fires to aid biodiversity. And yet we call that today fire suppression. What if we used these two lenses to look at the world through the lens of justice? And so the last part of my talk is that I want to ask all of us together in this conservation community to think about the ways in which conservation has been shaped by just looking at the world through a single lens of Western science. We have a whole class, a whole seminar that explores these ideas, so I'm just going to share a few of them with you today. And let's start with the myth of the pristine. The myth of the pristine is this often heard assumption that the lands before settlement were untouched by human hands, that was the reference ecosystem, right? And that we could somehow return to a state of pristine nature. Well, let me tell you, in order to return to a state of pristine nature, that means returning Native people's hands and science to the land, because that land is not pristine. It was shaped by the science and the management and the philosophy of Native people. Another example of the way in which conservation is shaped and restricted, I think, by only looking through the Western lens is the whole idea of ecosystem services, where there is this idea that there's a one-way flow from the land to people, as if the land belonged to us, as if it was property, whereas in the indigenous way of thinking, it's a two-way flow. People can be good for land. People can be medicine for the land. Not only does nature provide for people, but people provide for nature as well in a reciprocal exchange among relatives. How would conservation be different if we used that formulation? One of the really important elements when we think about justice and violence and erasure is that our very conservation icons in this country, the national parks, many of them have their origins in the removal, the violent removal of Native peoples and their land caretaking from the national parks. Conservation in a colonial framework. My own homelands in Wisconsin, our tribal lands, are now the Forest Service lands. Think about that. How is that possible? Well, this is how it's possible. A history of colonization, of illegal, unscrupulous, dishonorable land taking. Every single acre of land on Turtle Island today is indigenous land, be it in private hands, in public hands, state, federal. This is a gift. It is certainly a responsibility to say, what is our responsibility to the fact that all of our conservation work, all of our research work is done on indigenous homelands? What do we do about that? How does the conservation community reconcile with this history of injustice that continues to separate indigenous peoples from our homelands? What are our responsibilities in that way? So we have to return to this theme of the role of the nature writer in seeking justice, in connecting the science and the culture, connecting justice to our ecological sciences. And land justice has become a very significant element of the research, outreach, and education of the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment. In fact, just this weekend, we have a convening around land justice that brings together conservation NGOs and agencies and indigenous conservation leaders, and we're really excited about that. What does justice look like? I'm just going to really whisk through these and I hope to sort of just have your brain churning with ideas. What does justice even mean? In Anishinaabe, Potawatomi ways of thinking about justice, justice isn't punishment. Justice is balance, recreating balance. Justice is understood that when something wrong has happened, when an ill has been done, it's the responsibilities of the parties to reconcile and make it right through giving back, through counsel, through regenerating balance. This is restorative justice. Restorative justice is the way in which Native peoples have solved these issues of justice and imbalance. And our work at the center is to create restorative justice for land and for people. What would that look like? Put on those glasses of Western science and Indigenous science and ask, what would justice for the land look like? Could it be restoration, healing the damage to the land that we have done as part of our obligation in occupying those lands? Rematriation, meaningful consultation. There's all kinds of examples. The return of land through Indigenous protected areas in the land back movement. And if you haven't read David Troyer's brilliant article in The Atlantic about let's give the land, the national parks, back to their original landholders, rights holders. There can be no better remedy for the theft of land than land. The land back movement has many manifestations all over the world. How can we, as conservation biologists, environmental scientists, turn our attention to the justice of land back? And I want to uphold and honor the fact that land back is happening right here in what is today called New York State through the return of lands to Onondaga Nation. These have incredible value culturally, ecologically, and I think spiritually as well. Justice requires access and stewardship for the original caretakers of these lands. Could we think about the tools of conservation biology, of easements for cultural easements as a conservation practice, reuniting people and land again for mutual caretaking? Doing restoration projects, getting your hands dirty by healing the damage we have done is a powerful act of justice for the land. But when we think about restoration, when we think about, as I often do, the role maybe of the nature writer as a healer, we have to recognize that it's not the land that's broken. It's our relationship to land that's broken. A sacred lake filled with mercury is the sign of a broken relationship. And so we need to heal that relationship as well as heal the land. This requires the power of story. This requires mind, body, emotion, and spirit all engaged in healing a relationship to place and to one another. My friend, ethnobotanist and restoration ecologist Gary Nabhan says that what we need to be involved in is restoration, to create and indeed perhaps remember a different story of how it is that we might live here. What would restoration look like if it was inspired by the Indigenous worldview and restoration? It would not be only restoration of structure and function of ecosystems, but restoration of subsistence, foraging relationships, restoration of tending relationships, restoration of place names. This place was not always called Syracuse. What does it mean to decolonize our minds and our geographies by bringing back and remembering original names? And this work is underway. I had to put this slide in. Every time I get to say Secretary Deb Haaland, I'm going to say it. And under her awesome leadership, over 900 place names, federally identified place names, have been changed to decolonize the geographies of our landscapes. Decolonizing the story, right? Decolonizing the story we tell about whose land this is and what happened here. All of this leads, again, to some of the work thematically in the center of what we today call biocultural restoration. We're teaching a class in biocultural restoration this semester about how do we heal relationships to place as well as land. What we're really striving for is reciprocal restoration. Thinking about ways in which when we restore land, and we repair ecosystems, the ways in which that revitalizes culture. And when we revitalize culture, it's good for the land and it's good for the people. It is a kind of land justice. The notion of reciprocal restoration is that in healing the land, we are healing ourselves. The role of this nature writer, then, I can't answer it for all nature writers, is to try to work in restoration, in healing. But those wounds are very deep. When we consider the aftermath of colonization, which, by the way, has not ended. This is not I think that's the point that you're seeing here. It has not ended. We could consider the last 500 years really an eye blink of time in our history as humans on this planet. This era of Homo industrialis, let's call them, as the age of dismembering ecosystems, of dismembering communities, soils, watersheds, communities, entire peoples. The root word there, dismember. What does that mean? To cut apart, to exclude, to isolate, to cut off, so that what was once whole now lies broken in pieces. We have survived the age of dismembering. But I think that today we find ourselves in a changed time, or a changing time, to the era of remembering. Remembering cultural stories, remembering language and recipes and ceremonies and tools and plant names and bird songs and animal ways, remembering what our ancestors brought us here for, remembering what our descendants are asking of us. And remembering has another meaning as well, doesn't it? It's becoming members again of the family of more than human beings, renewing our bonds of kinship. The work of this nature writer is to cultivate remembering, the job to help remember ourselves and become once again members of a community of beings, not masters of the universe, but one member of the democracy of species. But you know what? It's not enough just to remember. We are called to create new stories for this moment, so that we leave behind our wisdom and tools for our descendants, just as the ancestors left theirs for us. What are the stories that we need to carry us through the narrowing of this time of climate change? That's up to us. Meet you, miigwech bisindawe. Thank you for listening. Thank you. Appreciate it.
I didn't want it to end. You are such a wonderful storyteller, and it's made even better when you get lost in those stories and tell us. Thank you so much. Let's have another round of applause for the wonderful Robin Wall Kimmerer. I also want to echo your words and express my gratitude to the members of the Onondaga Nation who have joined us here. It is our honor to welcome you here. I saw Tadada host Sidney Hill come in with his family and other members of the Onondaga Nation. Welcome and thank you for being here. And I want to thank again Sigrid and Al. Thank you for making this wonderful night possible for all of us. And I want to thank their there's a lot of work that goes into putting an event like this on, and Reagan and Bailey and Emily and the folks, Christopher Bicura, I know you're back there, who made this event all come together and work so well. Thanks for the work you did. I hope you'll all join us now for some dessert and continue the conversation and be back here again for the Dal Travis lecture next year. Thank you all very much.